So many people know that I am a huge Zelda fan. I love The Legend of Zelda. I think they're the best video games ever. And I love the art of the designs of the props. And I've decided to make a paper mache shield, Link's hero shield here. And what I first need to do is make the form. What I'm doing here is I'm taking regular cardboard, corrugated board, and I'm sketching out one half of the shield. And I'm taking regular scissors here for cutting the corrugated. Now, corrugated cuts okay with regular scissors. It works a little bit better with an X-Acto knife or a utility knife, but I understand that some people aren't really comfortable with that, so I didn't want to limit it to just using a utility knife. I'm happy to show anyone how to safely use one when you return to campus, but I first want to show you that you can use regular scissors with corrugated. Here comes the utility knife. What I'm doing is just going to carefully cut along the lines as I build the form for this shield. Now, you can use pretty much any material for making a form for paper mache. Traditionally, I think a lot of people use things like, for instance, balloons. You can inflate a balloon and cover it with paper mache and then pop the balloon. That's one way that people make piñatas, for instance, a nice hollow form. But you can really use almost anything. Some people take rolled up pieces of paper and tape them together. You can use aluminum foil. You can kind of use any kind of form you want. You can put wood inside of it if you need structure, or wire. Really, it's a form that you then put the paper mache over, and really all it does is holds the paper together in a shape while the paper and paste are drying. So what I'm doing here is I'm cutting out the form for the shield. A shield itself is relatively flat, but I wanted to give some form to the shield. I wanted to kind of make it look a bit more three-dimensional. So right here, I'm using scissors as a tool for doing what's called scoring. So I'm scoring the cardboard there, essentially just kind of crushing it in a straight line, and it gives it a certain area of weakness for the fold to happen. So it's a controlled fold. If you ever have played around with cardboard, corrugated board, you've noticed that it can fold really easily along the corrugation lines, but it doesn't want to fold very easily against the corrugation lines. So scoring is a really, really simple but very effective technique of controlling how a fold happens. So as I said, that a shield is a relatively flat form, but I wanted to give this kind of a little bit of a pyramidal shape to it, off-center pyramidal shape. So by cutting out that skinny triangle, that skinny wedge, and then bringing the two angles there together, I've created some depth to the cardboard. And I'm just, again, taping this together. It doesn't need to be super strong. The more paper mache that you add, the stronger that the form will be. So what I'm doing here is I am laying out some additional form that I'm going to glue onto that shield piece. Trying to transfer my lines. I'm working a little bit rough here. Paper mache in general is kind of a bit of a rough medium to work with. You can be very careful with it and be very exact, or you can be kind of sloppy with it if you want. It depends on what kind of finished product you want out of it. This shield, I was a little bit sloppy with it, but you'll see that it comes out pretty nice. So here again, I'm using the utility knife to cut the cardboard. The blade in there is a very, very fresh, brand new blade. It's really important when you're using a utility knife to use a sharp blade. You have a lot more control with the blade when it is sharp. Oftentimes it's when the blade gets dull that people kind of force the knife, and that's when it can slip and you can cut yourself. So I'm using a very fresh blade, and I believe I even switched the blade halfway through this project. So here I am transferring the shape that I cut. I apologize, I didn't do the best job of framing some of these shots. This is my first YouTube style video, so please bear with some clunky filming, if you will. I'm just transferring my lines here so that I can cut out the forms, and you'll see what I do shortly about kind of building up the form. Much of this video here is sped up. There is no way that I would use a utility knife as fast as I have on some of these cuts. That would just be completely reckless. So this is definitely fast forwarded. Again, you can use scissors for cutting up the cardboard, but I find that I personally I have a lot more experience with a utility knife and feel more comfortable with it. Use only what you're comfortable with. So I believe I cut out 4 of those longer pieces and 4 of the shorter pieces. I'm moving my work area over into the other part of the shop, and as you can see I have a hot glue gun there warming up, and I am laying out the pieces that I want to glue up to build up the edge of that shield, kind of thicken the edge of the shield on the sides. So the pieces that I cut out were not fully exact, so at some point here I have to kind of fill in a few gaps, but again, this is a little bit rough. You can be a little bit rough with the paper mache, and just like the 3D letter, you can fill in some of the gaps. So that hot glue gun is a little bit undersized for the bigger pieces there, but it's working okay. As you can see, there was a little bit of a gap in the center there. I'm not concerned with it. Right there, I'm actually filling a bigger gap in the bottom, but it's cardboard. You can cut off little slices, fill them in here and there, and use glue or tape or whatever you need to make up the form. So my main form is done there, and now I'm going to grab a few pieces of scrap and freehand some drawings of the center Triforce piece for the shield. That's the 3 triangles in the middle. Using a pair of scissors to cut the cardboard. If I had really wanted to, I could have been very careful about measuring how the shape of the triangles, but I'm keeping this a little bit kind of free form. I'm not too worried about accuracy on this. It's all, close enough. So right here, I'm putting that center triangle over the seam. You can see where it doesn't really, it kind of teeter-totters right on that seam. I'm going to use the back side of that knife to score the center of that cardboard and essentially just crush it so that it can bend a little bit and fit over the form of that seam a little bit better. Using more hot glue to glue down the cardboard layers to get my center Triforce piece there. And then what I'm doing here is I'm making kind of a double layer, because what I want to do is have a bit of that pyramidal form. And because I'm using the paper mache, as I lay the paper over those forms, it'll fill in the gap that's left by the step of those triangles. And you'll see how that comes out. What I'm doing here is I am laying out this kind of zigzag pattern that is from the shield. It's a little bit tricky because, like I said, I'm keeping this a little bit free form as far as not measuring things out. That was just a sketch on there. But I do want to make sure that I'm relatively consistent from the left side and the right side. So what I did was I traced that form, that paper, and cut it out, and then traced it to another piece of cardboard. And this is all just scrap from when I cut out the original forms. And I'm cutting that and scoring it so that one piece can fit there and then the other one can fit on the other side. Similar to the triangles, what I wanted to do was have the center portion of those zigzags have a bit of a straight edge in the middle. So I grabbed a piece of wooden dowel here, and I'm cutting little tiny chunks of wooden dowel, and I am going to glue them into the center of that zigzag form using some hot glue, and kind of carefully laying those over the center of the zigzag. And when I cover that with the paper mache, it'll kind of fill in the gap. It'll fill in the gap of the dowel and the cardboard, and it'll give it kind of more of like a mountain range kind of form to it. Okay, so here I'm actually using paper bags. This was recommended by Luke Yeager, who also works in the Fimbel Lab. He said that he really likes using the paper bags. So one thing that I did kind of mess up here was that when I prepped my paper, I really should have cut it up, ripped it up into smaller pieces. You can see I have kind of some longer strips, and I should have thought ahead about what kind of forms I was trying to cover here. So I should have really ripped these up even smaller. One thing that is interesting about the paper mache, oh, yep, so do not glue on our cutting mats. That creates a bit of a mess. So I'm going to move that out of the way and put down some paper so that we can kind of stay a little bit clean. Here I'm going to mix up a third type of paste. This is Elmer's glue and water. It's a 50-50 mix. That seems to work really well with this. But basically just watering down glue. This Elmer's glue works well. One issue that I've had with the flour paste is that if you ever store your creations, the things that you're making out of paper mache, in, say, for instance, a basement or an attic, mice really like to eat the flour-soaked paper, whereas the Elmer's glue, they don't seem to go after as much. So there I am ripping the paper into smaller chunks because I have to fit the small pieces over my small forms. So I put a nice even coat of the glue and water mixture over this paper, and sometimes I even like to soak the paper in the glue, and that really makes it really malleable. So one thing about the paper mache form, the paper used for the paper mache, is that if you use a cut edge of the paper, it seems to leave a bit more of a seam in the paper, whereas if you use fully ripped up pieces of paper, as you can kind of imagine, when you rip a piece of paper, you're actually kind of ripping the fibers, and the edges of the paper are thinner right where the rip is, as opposed to kind of like a hard cut edge. So I recommend taking a little bit more time than I did to prep your paper, and paper is cheap, so if you end up ripping more than you need, it's not that big of a deal to recycle whatever is left over. But here I'm taking my time using smaller pieces to kind of fill those steps, the gaps of those steps in the pyramidal forms and the zigzag kind of mountain ranges there. As you can see, on the spots that I've already kind of put down the paper, there's a lot of glue kind of left on the surface there. You can work really pretty wet with this, and right there I didn't even dip that piece at first. I used it as a sponge to kind of soak up the other glue. And this right here, I am working the paper into those seams of the built up layers of the cardboard, really covering the edge of the kind of open side of the cardboard. And I'm wrapping it around the sides and onto the back there. And now in the center here, I'm putting down more pieces, more out of a way of keeping a consistent form. So I technically didn't need to add paper mache to the kind of middle field there, but I wanted to give it the same texture feel as the rest of the piece. And right here, kind of rubbing my fingers, making sure that all the seams kind of lay flat into the corners there. It's really important now to let this air dry for at least 24 hours or maybe even more, depending on how many layers of paper and paste you put onto that piece. So now this is the piece fully dry. I believe it was possibly 2 days there. And what I'm doing here is I broke out some sandpaper, and if there were any kind of areas that kind of where the paper was maybe bunched up a little bit and it stuck up above the surface, I'm just kind of knocking off the edges there. And you can take your time with this. Sometimes you can, if you really want to make it kind of perfect, you can take your time sanding it and really get away from any of the seams. So right now what I'm doing is I'm priming this. I could have covered it with the newsprint to give myself a nice clean surface, but what I wanted, because I knew I was painting this with a few different colors, I decided to use this Kills primer. There's pretty much any primer would work for this, but this is just what I had on hand. So I'm going to give it one nice solid layer of primer and make sure that there's no real gaps. If there were, I could go in and fill them in, maybe with some more paper mache if need be. So back to the craft cabinet here, and grabbing some more of the blue paint and some brushes. One thing that I regret on this project is I should have been a little bit more careful at this step. I'm basically painting the back field of the blue shield, and I wish I had kind of been a little bit more careful about where the blue was. And that's primarily because when I do my next step of painting the Triforce, the center triangles, I realized that the craft paint, you can kind of see through it, so it needed a few more layers. So what I realized that I should do is carefully tape out where I wanted to have the different colors of paint. So this is blue painter's tape. It's something that you can purchase at the hardware store. Some people like to use masking tape. So you could either, for instance, be really careful about where you paint, or this is a great method of kind of, I'm a bit of a sloppy painter, so I make up for it with carefully taping instead of carefully painting. So essentially I'm taping off the edges. Anywhere the blue tape is where the blue paint is going to remain. So we're all taped off here, and I reach for the yellow paint for the Triforce. And that's when I realized that the blue paint was kind of seeping through. So what I ended up doing was just gave a really, really heavy coat of the yellow paint. Typically, I don't like to lay on the paint as thick as I did there, but it worked. It worked well. So I think I let that dry overnight. And now I'm going to go back and kind of give a second coat of primer where I realized that the blue paint was a little bit strong on the edges there. So one thing about the blue painter's tape is you don't want to have it stay on the piece for too long. Sometimes the adhesive can actually stick to the paint below and peel it up. So you want to not keep it on there for too long, a day or two at most. So here I've mixed up some gray paint, and I am painting the outside of the shield here. I had mixed up that paint out of some black paint and some white paint that we have. And later on here, I've mixed up a few different shades of gray to give myself some highlights. But that all it took was one decent coat of the gray paint around the edges and on those center pieces. The paint is all fully dry now, and now I'm going to carefully peel up the blue painter's tape and reveal the nice crisp paint lines. As I said, I'm a bit of a sloppy painter, so this is kind of the only real way that I end up with some straight paint lines. But you do what you can. You do what you need to make it work. So there we are with the shield fairly well fleshed out. And I'm going to shift gears here. Because we are the Maker Lab, we have all sorts of cool things like really nice software, Adobe Illustrator. I'm going to take the bird design here, and I am using Adobe Illustrator to generate some geometries so that we can use our laser cutter to cut out that bird shape. This right here, I'm flying right through this. This is not necessarily to teach how to do this, but just to kind of walk through every step of the Illustrator process to show how you can go from an image fairly quickly to the outline geometries. Here I am at a different computer and at our laser cutter. So we have two different laser cutters. The larger one is a 120 watt and the smaller sister is a 60 watt laser cutter. I've loaded up my file here and I am adjusting the settings. So I'm going to be cutting out some paper. These right here are our sample chips that give us the direction of the settings for the laser, for the different power for the laser, so that it will have enough power to cut all the way through the piece but not set it on fire. It's a fairly simple process. It's a little bit more intimidating than I was very intimidated at first, but it's actually a relatively simple process. There's a few simple rules that you have to follow. For instance, the laser needs to be focused at a very particular length off of the piece. And this little triangular thing here is our key, our tool that makes sure that we are focused on the piece. And then I've sent over the file. Right here I am turning on the compressed air. There's an exhaust system and compressed air that sucks the fumes out of the laser cutter. So this is actually the real time. The rest of this video has been very much in fast forward, but this, even though it looks like it is in fast forward, that's the actual speed of the laser. It cuts out remarkably fast. It's an amazing piece of equipment that each of you can use when you finally make it to campus. So there we are with the bird cut out. Again, I could have carefully painted that on this piece, but I'm not the sharpest painter, so this seems to be a nice option. So I'm just kind of carefully figuring out how I'm going to lay this piece on here and dealing with that ridge. But I basically just folded the piece of paper some, and I'm using hot glue to glue the red pieces down. So the next step here, I'm kind of adding some embellishments. I'm going over the lines of the the paint lines there to kind of have them kind of accentuate them, make them pop a little bit more. It kind of adds this style adds a little bit to the cartoon quality of the shield. Something like this would be fantastic for cosplay, for instance. And by using this paint shading technique, I'm kind of going over some of the planes that would be highlighted in light and kind of accentuating some of the shadows of the piece. So this is the final shield. This is the finished bit here. You can see the lines that I had drawn on there. So the three-dimensionality of this piece is a little bit subtle, but you can see right there that it is indeed there. On other pieces, you could go really three-dimensional with paper mache. That's what it really excels at. You can see that it's not perfect. You can see some of the paper lines and some of the spots where I wasn't exact, but it worked out well. Thanks for watching.